that apply to South Carolina. And while we have the general things under federal law, sometimes our state will be an exception because of the way our state law um, requires us to carry out our duties. And then, in addition to our state statute, we have state regulations under 4380. That's our transportation regs. Then the U.S. Department of Ed also has some guidance that they've put out specific to transporting students with disabilities. So I've included the name of that document here as well. But an example of one of the things that applies to South Carolina that's in our statute and regulations that is not in other states is the fact that right now the state is responsible for providing free transportation to our students, and the state owns most of our school buses, with the exception of course, buses. Individual school districts can supplement our fleet by purchasing some of their own buses. One of the reasons that some districts do that is because there are some restrictions on the use of state buses, and they want to use the buses for different things. And if it's not within the scope of what state law is, or it's not written into a student's IEP, or you're transporting not just students with disabilities, but our gen ed students as well, there could be conditions where the district would have to reimburse the state a certain amount for mileage for using the bus for something that's outside the scope of our state statute or regulation. So some districts will purchase their own buses, or some buses to supplement the fleet. Now, we do still have one district that contracts out their school bus transportation. The important thing to know is, regardless of whether that district is contracting out transportation or they're using all the state buses and have their own drivers, all of the same rules apply. It's no different than if you contract out for speech services or OT services or PT. That person is your agent. That company is working on your behalf. So they have to comply with all of the necessary laws and rules and regulations as well. Okay, so, and in getting into that, next slide.
Barbara, how would you like questions? Do you want to wait or interrupt?
Um, let's get through a couple of slides
Okay.
and then we'll go ahead and we'll take some questions. But it's possible, don't be offended if I say hold that,
Okay.
because it may be likely that I'm going to get to that topic. And so, if that's the case, then I may say hold that, but I am willing to go ahead and take some questions as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. And again, for the focus of this particular presentation, we are more so going to focus on what's required under the IDEA. But again, everything on that previous slide will be interwoven. And the important thing to remember for yourselves, as well as any trainings that you may do within your districts, or as you're engaging in your decision-making processes, is to understand, remember, under the IDEA, what is the purpose of that statute? It's to ensure the delivery of services to children with disabilities through the provision of a free, appropriate public education. We want to ensure equal educational opportunities. And that's one of the reasons why transportation is very important, because think of it this way. If you have those, you can't just say, well, we have these things available, but then not provide our children transportation so that they can avail themselves of all of the offerings. So to meet that requirement for FAPE, to make sure you're meeting the requirement for the equal educational opportunities, when you're at that table and you're engaging in your decision making, think about whether or not transportation for this child is going to be necessary to ensure that the purposes of the IDEA are met. And it's not just to make sure that they have an equal educational opportunity to participate in your regular academic activities, but it's also full participation in non-academic activities, extracurricular activities, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. So think about it in that broader scope. Here's an example, or a seed to think about. When you're at that table and you have a kid who you've placed out of your district through a multi-district agreement, and that student wants to participate in a non-academic activity or an extracurricular activity, You also have to you might have to make sure you have someone at that table for the decision making who can who knows what the high school league requirements are, because there's certain requirements with regard to where you attend school in order to participate on that particular team. So again, it's not just what's happening within the four walls of that classroom or that school, but it's also in the regular school day, it's also your non-academic activities and your extracurricular activities as well. Next slide. And this just reinforces all of those things because, again, one year we had a complaint and it dealt with a situation where it's a low incidence population. The student had a hearing impairment. He was in a very small rural district. And the law says you don't have to create a program if you just have the one student, but you must ensure that that student receives what he or she needs. So as a result, that district engaged in a multi-district agreement with another district. This was a middle school student. The student wanted to play football. The district that was providing the services, the receiving district, they contacted me. They said, we've worked it out. There's no problem. He can play football. Here's the problem though, because when you're engaging in your multi-district agreements, what happens? That kid is getting on a bus, going to their, regular school, then getting on another bus usually, and then they're going to where they're receiving services, and then they leave there and they come back. Well, that was going to cause a problem because this kid's parent didn't have transportation, to for him to participate in sports in the district that was providing services. He wasn't going to be back home in time enough to participate on the football team, middle school football team where he lived. So the receiving district said, we've worked it out. We've got everything. We've got the okay. He can play here, but he needs a sign language interpreter during after school hours for
Mhm.
practice, for the football games, and he needs transportation back to his home. Now, the home district was sending a bus, and that bus was going back, but he's going to be left behind for practice and then for games. The home district even said, we have a sign language interpreter who's lined up, but that cost wasn't figured in when we did our initial multi-district agreement. So then the question became, who provides the transportation and who pays for the sign language interpreter? Well, this wasn't a situation where the mother said, I want my kid to go to school an hour away. And if he was at home, guess what? The middle school was actually within walking distance of his home, and transportation wouldn't have been a problem. So, but for the home district engaging in a multi-district agreement and sending that child outside of his own school area, this kid would have been able to participate in football because he was otherwise qualified. They were like, yeah, he would make the team. That's not a problem. So what do you think the resolution was? It was that the home district had to pay for that sign language interpreter because it was the home district that caused him to not be able to play for his home school, and to provide that transportation back home because it was through the actions of the school district that caused him not to be able to have the equal opportunity to participate in non-academic and extracurricular activities. Okay, next slide. And transportation is counted as a related service. And as you can see, I've got the statutory reference and I've got the regulatory reference. That way, if you need those references when you're talking to someone or to go back and look at a section. But you can see in the definition of related services, what do we have? Transportation and such developmental and corrective other supportive services. So transportation is a related service because it's related to that kid having access to their educational program. And it's listed there along with speech language services, interpreting services, and our other typical related services. Next slide. Okay. And you can see school health services. And we're going to get into that connection between transportation and school health services, because a lot of times people are only thinking about school health services in the context of what that student needs between 7:15 and 2:15 or 7:15 and 3:30. But School health services go beyond that typical school day as well. They go outside the walls of that building. Next slide. Okay, so what transportation services are available for students who are eligible for special ed and related services? And I'm saying this in the context of IDEA, but when you think about students who have 504 plans, you need to go through the same thought process. So transportation includes travel to and from schools and between schools. That's why when we have our multi-district agreements, we've got the transportation going to that other district. Travel in and around school buildings. Yes, that can become an issue as well. We had a call last year, and this wasn't a typical one, but the call came in because there was orientation. And initially, they met in a building that was over near the new football stadium. And then they had a bus that was to then take everyone over to the new school. It was kind of like they wanted to have this aha moment. We're going to take everybody in. We want them to see this great new building, and they had a bus in case there was someone who could not walk up the hill to the new school. Guess what the bus wasn't? Wheelchair accessible. That should have been an automatic thought that whether we need it or not, we need to have a bus that's wheelchair accessible. Because again, buses with specialized equipment or adaptive buses with lifts, ramps, whatever's necessary, all of that are needs. And when you're thinking about transportation, you have to think about it in terms of not just the students, but also the parents. Because what about field trips? What if you have a parent who has a disability who wants to chaperone a field trip? You should automatically be thinking about those things beforehand. You cannot exclude that parent from the field trip on the basis that the parent needs an accommodation, because then you'll have a 504 and an ADA problem. Next slide. Travel training. You'll see references to travel training when you're talking about transportation. Travel training is actually included under the definition of special education, however, instead of as a related service. But travel training is instruction that enables children with significant cognitive disabilities and any other children with disabilities who require instruction to develop an awareness of the environment in which they live and to learn the skills necessary to more effectively and safely go from place to place within your environment. How is there anyone who has a good example of travel training and when you see it most often? Anybody but Sarah first.
Include someone who needed the O&M, the orientation and mobility to learn how to cross streets and do that kind of stuff.
That's exactly right. And welcome, Miss Cunningham.
Would
Glad I'm
this
here.
would this include having or needing transportation to voc rehab or something for transition services?
Exactly. That's one of the things I was going to get to later, but that's exactly right. Think about it in terms of you've got a partnership with Oak Rehab. This is written in as a part of their post-secondary transition. Yes, they need to get there. Not only Voc Rehab, and we'll go ahead and go through that now. What about your kids working on the high school credential to get to their workplaces? That also is a part of this requirement. What about kids going to, if they are assigned or they were up for expulsion and in lieu of expulsion, they're being assigned to the alternative school program and it's a different location? Yes. A question or a situation that came up a couple of weeks ago is as a part of being in the alternative school program, they said the students had to, if they were there for a drug related offense, then they had to go through drug counseling. But the district did not want to provide transportation. But then they had a condition: if they didn't participate in the drug counseling, then they couldn't go back to their home school. The district put that condition on being able to return to the home school. So whose responsibility is it to ensure that student is able to get there?
The
The
school.
district's. You know, what about when it's no different than saying the student can't return to school until they engage in mental health counseling? Well, the smart thing or the reasonable thing is that then the district provides that mental health counseling on site. But if the district doesn't and the student has to travel for those mental health services, that's the district's responsibility. That's not mama's responsibility, Uncle John's or Big Mama or Miss Pitty Pat from Sunday school. And once the district makes that a condition of that child benefiting from and participating in their educational program, then transportation is the responsibility of the school district. If the school district is doing an evaluation and there's part of the evaluation that the school district's not able to do, let's say the determination is that this student needs a neuropsychological evaluation and the child doesn't have transportation to go to Atlanta for that neuropsychological evaluation or Charlotte or Charleston, who has to pick up that cost? Because remember, evaluation is at no cost to the parent or student. Okay, next slide.
Miss Drayton, this is Suzanne Terry. I do have a question about that. So we had that issue in our district. That's why I brought that up, that our district said that, or the transportation director told us that they could not provide transportation for our students to go to voc rehab. So we actually had to put it in their IEP to state that the district would provide for those services because it's out of our county. Is that like we need to have that part in the IEP?
Yes.
For that?
Yes, you can put it in the IEP. They should be doing it, but if not, put it in the IEP, put it in the 504 plan, and then there's no question about it. It has to be done. Same thing for Career and Technology Center. If as a part of that decision-making process, if the IEP team determines this is what this kid needs to receive a free, appropriate public education, then it needs to be in the IEP. Whether it's a special ed service, a related service, a supplementary aid or service, whatever that team determines the student needs, the team needs to go through the decision-making process and needs to put it in the IEP. Okay. Next slide. And the decisions, and we know, Lord, do we know that we've had some challenges with transportation right now with regard to shortages of drivers, support people on buses when they're needed. But at point blank, it comes down to the fact that you can't make decisions based on funding restrictions, administrative convenience, and across the board discriminatory practices. It all has to be about the unique and individual needs of the student. Point blank. So if your district has a policy where they're saying, well, you know, we are short on drivers, so don't write that into the IEP, but that's what's necessary to meet the child's needs, to not give that child what he or she needs could come back to bite you in the badunkus. How? The kid doesn't receive the appropriate post-secondary transition services. That is one of those places where you know where it says to age 21, where they can come back and then end up with services beyond age 21, or you're paying for that kid to go over to Kenneth Schuler to get their cosmetology license, or you're paying for Uber or a taxi to take that kid wherever they need to go, because once they leave school, they didn't meet their goals. And it wasn't because they didn't have the ability, it's because they were denied what they needed to access those services. You know, some places there's regional transportation that you might be able to make arrangements with. I think I saw Mishko on the call. There was a situation a few years ago with Cheryl, and she had a kid, and that kid, for what they needed to get into Florence, and she contacted PD Regional Transportation so that they could make sure that that kid was able to get from Lake City into Florence. So you can do those contracts for the services. Okay. Are there any questions before I go past that slide?
Well, Barbara, I'll admit I've been filling up the chat, but you can wait and decide when you want to answer those questions.
Okay, let me take a look here.
Miss McKay, I do agree with you with your first question. We had that issue a few years ago where they pick them up 30 minutes early and bring them like an hour early in the morning because we don't have drivers.
Right. And so I hadn't thought about not having drivers. It's just, Barbara, when you talked about, the state provides buses, I got thinking, well, what if the district is saying, well, we have to do this, time thing with the children so that we can get that, drop them off and then use the bus again. Could they ask the state, say, listen, here's our situation. We need another bus. Can they do that? Or is there a limit or to how many buses?
Every district then submits requests for buses to the state. They also submit their routing plans. So our transportation office deals with districts on a daily basis on that. But before the school year, we have to have the routing plans and all the districts request the buses. Usually we have enough buses. It's just the lack of people to drive them. That's usually more of the problem. We use, in the last 8 years, that was the whole big push in getting buses. We've gotten so much funding for buses, and we buy new buses and settlement monies from different things. We purchased buses. It's just that now we've got the problem of the drivers. That's been more of the situation. And so sometimes there are contracts that have to be done. And sometimes there's a problem with the unevenness of the contracts, because to do a contract, the person who's transporting that kid has to have, there's minimum insurance requirements. And of course, they need a license. And to get a license, they need a social security number or what's called an I-10 to fill out the W-9. So we do have some families who are willing to transport, but they got that little problem of no driver's license, and they don't have the requirements to get a driver's license. So I've run into that problem with one of our liaisons where they wanted to know how to get someone paid, and I was like, oh, they don't have a social security number or an I-10 number, which is a tax ID number for someone who's not a citizen. There is not a legal way to pay that person. Now, it doesn't mean you might not be able to contract with someone else. And, there've been some issues with transporting students who are in foster care as well. And DSS now doesn't want them transported in taxis, but they can be transported, by one of the contractors that's on state contract with DSS. If you run into that situation, they do have a list of providers who they have under contract. Okay.
Got it.
And I'm going to get to that other, so I'm going to hold that one a little bit.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Next slide.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So again, if the student qualifies for transportation as a related service, clearly explain that and put it in the IEP. And also, next slide, and I just put reference to, it's nothing new. You see the reference, go back. The letter that I put there, letter to Hamilton, that's a letter from the U.S. Department of Education talking about transportation. And that goes back to 1996. It's nothing new. Okay, so go back. Okay, next slide. Okay, also remember, least restrictive environment applies to transportation. It is illegal to across the board say if you have a disability, then you can't be on a bus with your non-disabled peers. We are trying to get out of calling buses special ed buses or special needs buses. A bus is a bus is a bus. You just have some buses that have specialized equipment, or buses that have the equipment to meet the specialized needs of students. And we've also told that, the department has driver trainers that work with the districts, and they are trying to get away from that perception of a bus just being for students with disabilities. And as you've noticed in the last few years with our new bus purchases, what do we try to ensure? that all of the buses are accessible, that they, as many as possible, have the wheelchair lifts, and that they have with those newer buses where they have rows of seats that can be removed if you need that bus to be accessible to someone who's in a wheelchair, so that when you have a bus, that you don't have to, a parent isn't waiting on two buses to come to their houses. They have twins, and one's got to be on this bus and one's got on this be on this bus, and the only difference being that Jimmy has a disability versus Joshua not having a disability. When you run that bus for efficiency purposes, you want to make sure that bus is able to serve all of our children. Now, sometimes we have a child who um, is on oxygen and they need the hookups, and you only have a certain number of buses that have the hookups for oxygen. Now, I'm going to throw out a question on this LRE. If you have a bus, you have a certain number of kids who do need buses with specialized equipment or that can meet their needs, and your other buses aren't, it's just not efficient, or you're not able to do it. But those decisions have to be made on an individualized basis. When you have those siblings or you have other children in the neighborhood and they don't have disabilities, can they ride the bus that has, let's say, 10 students with a disability? The buses that you typically are only running and picking up students with disabilities, but you have other siblings in the house who are going to the same school or other kids on that street. Can you use that bus to pick them up as well?
Yeah, I would think so, right? I mean,
Yes.
you're just providing transportation.
Exactly. You're providing transportation. And if there are seats on the bus and you've got butts that need a seat, put those butts in those seats. You know, that, so there, as long as they are not displacing someone who needs that oxygen hookup that's on that bus, that a bus is a bus. You know, it was hard for me to fathom or wrap my mind around it the first time a parent called and said, they've said my child can go on the field trip, but my child is on a bus by himself and everybody else is on the other bus. Why? Why would you isolate that student like that? And the reason was because he has a disability and he's in a wheelchair. That's discrimination. No. So LRE again applies to transportation as well. You have to go through that process because, as it says in the second bullet, the United States Department of Education states it is assumed that most children with disabilities will receive the same transportation provided to non-disabled children, consistent with the LRE requirements in the federal regulations for IDEA. And it says, unless the IEP team determines otherwise. And when you are removing that child with a disability from a service or a setting with their non-disabled peers, what do you have to do? Justify it. You need to justify it in writing. Next slide. I said, Deetra, you has a question?
Yes, I do. So just to go back real quick, when the question was raised in regards to a student saying having a sibling who does not have a disability, where the other student may have, say, a significant disability where the bus may require a lift. So it is permissible for the sibling who is non-disabled to be transported on the same bus with his disabled sibling?
Yeah.
Yes. Let me ask you, now I'm going to pose a question for you. Is it legal to put a student with a disability in a classroom with a non-disabled peer? In fact, the law
yes, I
requires
mean,
it.
I'm good with
Yes.
I agree with that, but I think we've had a lot of conversations about that. I think a part of it is for some of the non-disabled students having to be transported with maybe some of our students that may have some significant disabilities. They frown upon, like, I don't want to get on that bus, and it turns into a whole, behavior type situation. So I think that's probably been a part of the hesitation, but
And now let
I
me
learned
put a
something.
caveat on there. you shouldn't use it as a punishment. It's
No,
transportation.
no, what
You
you
shouldn't be
know, Beaufort
saying,
County,
if you better act right. If you don't act right, I'm gonna put you on that little bus over there with the kids in the wheelchairs and the significant
right, right,
disabilities. Now that
right.
is not cool.
Correct. Correct. Not even close. Because the issue, like I said, in Beaufort County, if many people may not know, we are spread wide.
Wide.
We we have a
Mm-hmm.
lot of ground to cover. And so with that being said, it would help tremendously with transportation if, that one bus that's picking up, everybody from one end can do that. But we were always it was kind of always frowned upon to place non-disabled students on our bus that would transport our students with disabilities, and so forth. But okay,
Yeah,
I'm
because
I'm good.
it would be like saying, people saying, well, there's still some people, public perception that they don't want students with disabilities in the classroom with their
Mhm.
non-disabled peers. So we have to get over that
Agreed.
hurdle, but we do have to ensure the safety of our students with disabilities, especially if they have significant disabilities, because you don't want a student feeling like they've been punished, or like you said, it ends up
Hmm.
with a behavioral issue where it could put another student's safety at risk. You have to be
Yes,
careful of
ma'am.
that. Okay. But
Thank
And
you.
Deetra, and I would just add, Deetra, it does sound like it would be a cultural shift. So there could be
hmm
some training involved all the way around. Yeah.
hmm
Thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
Barbara,
yeah,
actually, it would take away some of the stigma of being on the short bus if you had other kids who rode it too. So it
yes,
actually
just a
end up being
bus.
Just a
positive.
bus.
But now, the question I have is so it's no other funding issue around that where, we always think of special ed stuff being used only for special ed kids. So it's not any kind of funding problem that would come with that, or
it
issue with that.
Now, from the state perspective, we're just buying buses. And we're just buying buses. Now, the only thing I can see is if you had a situation where a district purchased that bus and they used IDA funds alone to um purchase that bus, then there may be some caveats there. But with regard to the state-owned buses, we're just purchasing buses. That's why the buses that we've purchased in the most recent years, why we've made sure that the bus is wheelchair accessible, so that when that bus stops, who's ever at that bus stop can get on that bus.
Yeah, that would really be great because I'm sure some parents would like it if their siblings could ride with, that disabled sibling. So, okay, thank
hmm
you.
Yeah, I mean, I had one of her parents, and she used to be on the advisory council. And she called me one morning because she was working in downtown Columbia and she lived within the city limits. And she was like, the bus is usually late, but it's been very flexible here. And her son has cerebral palsy. And when the weather was good, because it took him longer to get out to the bus and she wanted to work on his independence and walking, they had a chair like at the end of the driveway where he could walk out, take his time. He could sit in the chair until the bus came and she could watch him and then leave and go to work. Well, then they transferred her job way out to Blythewood. And I don't know how many of you know the dynamics of Columbia and know how far away downtown Columbia is to Blythewood. So she wasn't going to be able to do that. And we were talking, and I was like, why is he, why why isn't he on the bus that his siblings riding? And she was like, "Oh my God, I never even thought that he could ride the same bus as his siblings." She was like, "I am so ashamed. Here I am on the advisory council, the state advisory council, and I didn't even think about the fact that my children could ride the same bus." She was like, "Not only that, 3 other buses pass the house before his bus comes." And I was like, problem solved. That solves the problem. And she was like, it just did not occur to me. And the same thing happens with our folks who are in the field. they automatically think about that separation. But you have to think about it in the terms of a classroom and justifying that removal for, to separate transportation the same way you would if you're looking at moving that child to a more restrictive environment in the school setting. If there's a need for adult assistance, it could be because of problem behaviors or the impact of the student's disability because of their size, their medical needs, and all of that stuff. But even in districts as large as Greenville County, they deal with that. And so it's not an across the board, you can't have an across the board policy that just because you have those needs, because I've heard about situations in Greenville will say they'll have a kid who's on the bus who has a seizure disorder. Well, then they make sure they have that seizure kit on that bus and that they have an assistant on that bus who's been trained, because you have to think about the child's privacy. And that's part of what's in there is a curtain so that when they administer the diastat, they can ensure they have and they practice it beforehand so that they know that they can meet that child's needs. And they're like, yeah, we may have a bus that has to pull over on the side of 385, but we're not going to take that kid off that bus simply because the child has that medical issue. Again, we have kids who are medically fragile. Transportation can look more like a medical transport. We have that. We have districts that have contracts because the kids have such significant medical needs. And that went through the U.S. Supreme Court back in 1997 with the Cedar Rapids case. And they said, yes, an ambulance service could be specialized transportation. And the way that and with that case, they said it's like the door to the schoolhouse, that and the nurse for that kid. Once he got to school, he could participate, but it was in what he needed as far as related services and transportation services, because the child was on oxygen, but in the event that his oxygen failed, he had an ambu bag that is, and I mean, we've all seen the medical shows where they've got the ambu bag. And so they wanted to ensure safety during transport, and they did the ambulance service. I've had to deal with that in the low country. Door-to-door transportation, if you have a kid who's a runner, you might need door-to-door transportation instead of saying that kid's got to walk 2 blocks to the bus stop. Now, we do have a state law that says, because we've run into this, and there was a due process hearing request last school year where the parent wanted door-to-door transportation because she said her child was a runner, and that because of her work hours, she couldn't ensure that he would get to the bus stop safely. So she wanted door-to-door transportation. Well, in that case, the district said no. And so it was, what does the data show? And the data showed that there weren't any cases, or there was no evidence that he ran out into the street on the way to the bus stop, or reason why, based on the where she said she worked and the time that the bus picks up, why he couldn't go. There were no mobility issues. As far as tender age, the other kids were the same age going to the same bus stop. There was nothing that the mom was able to show with regard to his particular needs as to why he couldn't go to the bus stop along with everyone else. She said, well, one time when we were at the supermarket, he ran out into the street chasing a squirrel. I'm like, okay. And you teach him what? Don't run, don't chase squirrels. Your name is not Rover. Do not chase squirrels into the middle of the road. We can put in a plan do we need to address that? Don't chase squirrels. But that does not automatically equate, that one time doesn't equate to door-to-door transportation. Some students who may be alone and having to walk a certain distance to meet the bus, however, we have to take into consideration on vulnerability, because the way the world has gone, there may have to be some instruction for some students. If someone pulls over, even if they're in a brown van with brown shorts and a shirt on, and offer you a ride or offer you a piece of candy, We have to teach still stranger danger, because when my daughter was 16 and she had her first job and I needed to pick her up, and it was during the summer, she's working in the day and I'm running late because of work. She decided she was going to try to walk home. 3 men, she told me, pulled over trying to get her, offering her rides, including one in a UPS truck in his brown uniform, because she was 16, but she looked more like she was 12. But so sometimes we still have to talk about stranger danger. How often are you looking at something on TV, and especially recently, and kids have gone missing? Don't see kids. So, and then assistive devices. We've had some instances or reports of instances where, because bus drivers or support people on buses haven't been trained, kids sometimes have assistive devices because that's how they communicate, or that's what keeps them calm. We had a situation, and it was verified through the video, where the kid was told, where the kids weren't allowed to have access to their communication devices while being transported, and that someone made a statement about, if you break those, then transportation is going to have to pay for it to replace them. No, you can't deprive the kids of their ability to communicate. Next slide.
There you go.
Okay. And again, we talked about that specialized transportation may be necessary because the kid needs to get to their workplace. They need they're in the dual enrollment program. They may need transportation to the local technical college. We talked about the extracurricular and non-academic activities. Field trips. That one still is an issue. That is one that well, thankfully not as often, but it still comes up, where the child who needs specialized transportation, their parent doesn't receive notice of the field trip at the same time as other parents, or someone who's doing the planning in their district procedures. They don't request a bus that's accessible. In those situations, can you then at the last minute call Miss Margie and say, Miss Margie, I'm so sorry. We didn't order the correct bus, but we want to make sure that LaQuisha is able to go on the field trip. But we need you to take off from work tomorrow. We understand you work at Hardee's. If you don't work, you don't get paid. But we want LaQuisha on the field trip. But the only way LaQuisha can participate is if you take off and you transport LaQuisha, and you can follow the bus. Is that an appropriate resolution to the problem? Sarah?
So Barbara, I don't actually have the answer to this one, but I have a question. And now that I just am thinking it through, I think the answer is no, but I'm going to ask anyway. Can that parent
agree.
be hired as like an assistant for the day, so she's not losing her money from Hardee's to come and be the child's assistant, but it's really transportation? Never mind. I think I went off on a rabbit hole.
The answer is a unequivocal no. Because now you're conditioning. Have you made any other parent, have you said the only way LaQuisha can participate is if mom, dad, one of you takes off from work and transports LaQuisha? Are your students without disabilities, are their parents required to provide that transportation? And what if LaQuisha's mama's car isn't working? Or dad has to use the car to go to work, and somebody else was going to drops mom off at work so that she doesn't have to worry about transportation. That can't be the only resolution. Because when mom says no, now LaQuisha isn't able to participate. And why isn't she able to participate? Because of her disability. Now, what if LaQuisha also has diabetes and she is not capable of self-administering her insulin? And LaQuisha needs and the bus driver can't do it. And so Do you need to also make sure that you have the appropriate personnel for that field trip to administer LaQuisha's insulin on the field
Yes,
trip?
Yes.
yes.
Yes. And we talked about the participation in athletics or extracurricular activities. Next slide. Train, train, train. Bus drivers may not know all of the ins and outs, and trust me, they won't know all the ins and outs when it comes to working with students with particular disabilities. But it is critical that all bus drivers receive as much training as possible and as frequently as possible, and especially with dealing with our students with autism, our students with emotional disabilities, intellectual disabilities, healthcare, specialized healthcare needs. If you have a kid who has intermittent explosive disorder and you invade that child's space and it's predictable on how that child will react, and you don't train the bus staff on that, and something happens, who's liable?
Mhm.
The district will be. But guess who was also going to be named in any lawsuit? The state. Why? Because we own the buses, we carry the insurance on the bus, we provide the fuel. Even the people who work on the buses are state employees. We pay for it. We pay for the bus and everything associated with it, but we don't have a say in other than the training and the CDL requirements on who the district then hires to drive that bus. It's like having a vehicle and not being in control of the driver, other than they've got a driver's license and all those things. So when those things happen, when the things you see on the news where a kid gets hurt on a bus, guess who also gets sued? The state. And we're not happy about that. So you have to make sure that transportation happens. You have to make sure that there is a strong working relationship between your transportation people and your special education personnel. We train our driver trainers, and there's some districts though that have created a special program so that it's not worked out quite as well now with the driver shortages, but they had an additional training requirement for anybody who was going to be driving buses that they knew students with disabilities would be riding on, and then anybody who was going to be subbing on those buses,
Mhm.
because if buses break down and you've got to get an alternate driver or you've got the double route. And then some districts said, well, we're small enough that that could be any bus. Everybody's got to go do that extra training.
Mhm.
I participated in one of the trainings that the department initiated, and it's on evacuation of buses. And especially in what they did was they invited first responders in, because when something happens with that bus, those first responders aren't thinking there may be a child with a disability on that bus. They may have runners. So there were roles. Like someone was like, okay, you're a child and you're in a wheelchair and you don't want, and it's my chair, myself, and you don't want, if somebody touches your wheelchair, so the person was to play that role. Someone was going to be a runner because they was like, okay, you all evacuating the bus. Now this kid's taking off down the main highway. What's the communication that's necessary with the first responders in your areas who are likely to respond if you have an incident in your district where that bus runs off the road? What is your communication system? Because we know it's on an as needed basis. That's an as needed basis. What if the driver is unconscious and can't relay that information? Is there something else on the bus that's kept secure that has certain information in the event that there's another adult on that bus, or instructions that can be given when when someone calls 911, that they can information that can be passed along? you know Bus number so and so and so and so is involved in an accident. There are students with disabilities on this bus, including students with this. so that they're prepared. It was an eye-opening experience for the first responders when because they were like, no, no, these aren't things that we take into consideration or that we're thinking about beforehand. But forearmed, forewarned is forearmed, so that they can plan within. And then it was a small group of folks, but the intent was for them to go back and then train their persons or to let them know these are possibilities. But train, train, train. Next slide.
Barbara, before we go on, though, we've got quite a bit of questions going on. So one of the questions was from Cynthia Coker, do we have any good resources for training drivers? And I thought we had like a state level
We do.
training, but then Cynthia, are you also asked, because that should be like all drivers should be getting that, and that's some basic, not basic, but it's in depth training, and it includes students with disabilities, but it's like your general, here's what you do with a student with autism with a wheelchair, but that's not your student with autism, your student with a wheelchair who uses a wheelchair. So that's like, there are the two kinds of training. There's the, like, everybody gets at the universal training, but then you need that more specialized for the individuals on those buses. Is that what you're saying? There's two kinds of training.
And the department, Richard Podmore is our like state driver trainer person, and then we have regional people who work with the districts in their areas. And so, and I've participated in some of the state level with our driver trainers, and then they take it out and train the folks at the local level and are to serve as a resource. And then if our driver trainers get a question that they can't answer, they usually then bring it back to our transportation people, and then and we work together on problem solving.
Thank you. Could you say his last name again? Richard
Podmore, Podmore.
Thank you. I put that in the chat for everyone, and I'll find his email. So would there be a reason for district directors of special ed to contact him for training, or would they contact their transportation department? Should I get his email is what my point is.
Usually the protocol is going through your local transportation people.
Okay.
And then they work with our regional driver trainers unless there's a problem. Now, if there's a problem, then
Okay.
Richard may be, oh my God, we've got to mandate some training for this particular area, so.
Okay. Good. So just so you all kind of know what the process is, if you need training in at least you have a name, Richard Podmore. There you go. Thank you, Barbara.
If we see a lot of lawsuits out of a particular area and we see that there are students with disabilities who are involved, then that may be one of those where it's not optional. Because we also, and a lot of times that's what's included is, and then the state didn't do training as well as and so we have to, just like when I'll tell administrators, when that special ed director has this training and mandates that you all come, and it's to make sure that you're doing the right thing for the right reason and complying with the law, but that special ed director also has to cover his or her butt too, to show that they did the training, because we've had certification issues. And we had one in particular where with the district, and I'm not going to say which district, it's on our website, where the state board took action against a particular state director's licensure certification, because when it came up, and we knew it wasn't just one person, but what do you think the district did? That's that person's job. They didn't make sure that this was done. And that's how, that's the district was, made the choice that this is our fall person. That's that person's title. That falls under their job responsibilities. They didn't make sure that it got done. And so the board took an action against that director's certification. And think, whereas our special ed directors usually have some type of educator licensure, do our transportation people? Other than, no, not that falls under the state board authority. So And we have started now having I guess it's been 2 years now. We've been having hearings where the department has initiated the hearings, and we provide the hearing officer to suspend drivers' CDLs.
Mm.
Yeah, because we've had to take a more aggressive approach to our general supervision responsibilities. And are some of those people who've been driving buses with students with disabilities, and it's something that's happened with a student with a disability that caused us to have to take them to a hearing and pull their CDL. Yes. Okay. And this is a memorandum. I told you about the letter from 1996. This is 2003, where here it says state directors of special education must ensure that communication between districts and state transportation providers exists so that the providers are well informed and well trained to provide safe and appropriate student transportation. And that happens for our traditional buses. And you all know we have what we call a bus boat, right? Our Sandy Island bus boat.
Yeah. I want to
When-
drive it sometime.
Oh, no, that's too much liability. Because that's how the students from Sandy Island get to school. We send a boat over to get them. So we call it our bus boat. And then OCR.
Oh, sorry.
No, no,
There
no,
you go.
no. Next slide. And in addition to, OSEP and what they've said, the U.S. Department of Ed Office for Civil Rights will investigate allegations involving the lack of training of bus drivers and aides on buses. They say they have to be provided with hands-on training and proper methods of securing wheelchairs and any other things to meet those needs of students with specialized needs and who need specialized transportation. The obligation is the same, just like there's a provision in IDA that says you have to make sure that teachers are aware of what their responsibilities are in implementing IEPs. The same responsibility exists with regard to persons who are driving and working on buses with students who have disabilities and healthcare needs. Think about the bus as being an extension of the school program, because it is. Next slide. So, inquiring minds want to know. Here's the scenario.
There it is.
In my district, students with disabilities are sent home early, 30 minutes early to an hour. So earlier than their gen ed peers. And this doesn't seem right. When I asked about this, I was told all special ed students are released early. That's the rule. Is this legal? What did I say about all across the board policies?
Nope.
That is illegal, and it's discrimination. That's something that could end up in a state complaint, a due process hearing, or it could go to the Office for Civil Rights, because you're treating students with disabilities different than students without disabilities. Why? Because they have a disability. That one's an easy one if you're an OCR investigator. So the answer is no. When you say all students with disabilities are released early, that's the trigger. And that's the rule. That's discriminatory, and it violates IDA, Section 504, the ADA, and if that student is also an English language learner, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a bunch of federal law violations. Okay, next slide. Okay, what if the bus driver works in a class as a one-on-one adult assistant for a specific child, but that person also drives a bus? So they leave the school where he or she works before the end of the day to run a double route or to get to the middle school to pick up children by a certain time. Now, that specific child's IEP says they're to have a one-on-one adult assistant. But again, that person is leaving because they've got to do their bus route. Is there a problem with that?
I wouldn't think there would be a problem unless they don't replace that person with another person for the one-on-one.
And
If it's
that's
written in the IEP.
And that's the kicker, because if that student has a one-on-one, you better believe it's in their IEP. And if there's not someone else covering, and the reason that child has that one-on-one is for a specific reason, whether it's healthcare or whether it's behavior. Now, let's say it's behavior. And I'm going to give you a scenario that I ran into. And the attorney for the district did a great job of maintaining his composure while he made his argument. And in this particular case, the child was now up for expulsion because I'm just going to tell you exactly what happened. The kid was masturbating in class. And the sensory stimulation, because with the disability, that was why they had the one-on-one. Now, that it shouldn't have just been there to say stop, don't, pulling his hands, but also teaching or providing other methods for the child to get the same effect that he was looking for without engaging in that particular behavior. But the aid wasn't, the one-on-one adult assistant wasn't there, and that's when he engaged in the behavior that he was now up for expulsion for. Well, you know that part when you get to the MDR that says, is the behavior the result of failure to fully implement the IEP? Can you get past that part? Not at all. Because there was a reason why the one-on-one adult assistant was placed with the child to begin with. Now that person's not there, so the opportunity presented itself and the kid took advantage of it. That is going to be related to the disability, which means baby comes back the next day. That child remains in that school setting. Okay. What if the school dismisses students with disabilities early so they can avoid the crowds in the hallway to get to their buses 15 minutes earlier than other children each day? What about that one? Is that one a little trickier?
Maybe if they're dismissing all students with disabilities early, if it's specific to certain students that might need to be out of the crowd, then I think it might be okay.
Okay. Now, what if that child's receiving special ed services at the end of the day and they're missing 15 minutes of their special ed time?
Not okay.
I think the special ed teacher or speech or whoever they're getting 15 minutes at the end of the day can follow them to the bus and provide the service on the bus.
Okay,
Come
my
on, it
problem,
doesn't say you
Agreed.
have to be sitting, you're behind in a classroom somewhere. Like, can't you do, well, maybe not, but I'm just saying.
Could they not
well,
write that?
my problem is, what if school dismisses students with disabilities early? Are you talking about all students? Because not every
Just
student
one.
has to avoid the crowd. I could see if a specific student in their IEP said that they had to be released early, but I don't think you can release all students early.
Right.
The
that's-
all is a definite no. Now
Right.
let's talk a little bit more about the individual student situation. Okay, we've got one that says, well, let's say if it says 15 minutes early because let's say it's the child has behavioral issues during unstructured time and they get in, or anxiety. Instead of putting the child on medical homebound because mama said he or she has anxiety and crowds are one of the triggers, is that a possible accommodation that could be made?
Yes.
Okay, now let's also say the child has a disability in the area of, let's say it's a younger child, reading, and their participation in the gen ed setting for ELA is at the end of the day.
Oh, you got me.
I asked, this one you can make a little trickier.
Yeah. I think
You
William,
might
I
William
think if
has
it's in
another-
relation to their disability, then according to what the kid needs is how the IEP needs to be written. Like
Yes.
reading
if
and
they
then-
have
also have to-
anxiety,
Go ahead.
then they may need to.
But you also have to look at what is that child missing? Is there a way to rework their schedule so that they're not missing anything related to their special ed or related services or their participation in their core academic periods? Is that always easy? No, But but you may have to then look at, what if the child is to receive extra time on tests and the test is at the end of the day? What are those other things that it may impact? You always have to look at, when we make this decision, are there other changes that we may need to make in the child's educational program, because it's a trickle down effect.
What if you change it to releasing them 5 minutes after everybody else?
That could be also a workaround. Exactly. But then what if it says, oh, but when they get on the bus, it triggers them because now everybody else is on the bus and they freak out. What if it's a kid who gets ultra bothered because the child has autism and someone sits in their spot? And so it's also to make sure that that child gets on the bus to get his or her spot so nobody else sits in it.
That is the bus. Oh, I'm sorry. I always think I'm a participant, don't I?
No. But that was good because it ties it in to the responsibility of the bus driver as well.
That's the bus driver's like, nope, this is assigned seating. Sorry, move. Like, this is Billy's, this is LaQuisha's, like, whoever, this is their seat.
Being
Move on
aware
down
of
the
what
aisle.
goes on the bus. And what's going on, because we have a district that is paying for residential right now, and it all stemmed from an incident that started on the bus, and things that were triggers for the child, and nobody had that proper communication with the bus driver, and there was just something about the student who has a disability and this other child who just knew how to push that child's buttons, and they knew that it was worse than oil and water. And it started with that kid without a disability being in that kid's seat and then getting in that child's face, and that child lost it. They ended up having to evacuate the bus. They called in law enforcement. And what did law enforcement not have? The information regarding this child, and the officers who are responding don't always have the information on or training on how to deal with children with certain disabilities. And they're calm down, calm down, calm down. Is that going to make this child calm down if that child is still going up? Or does that child have to get up to that point and then start coming down? And taking hold of that child while they're still going up is one of the worst things that you can do, and someone can get hurt. But how it was handled has now led to that district paying for an out-of-home placement for this child. And it all started with the bus. And that training and the recognition of how to handle that situation wasn't there. Okay. So, and then again, that early release so that the bus can can beat the traffic. Under state law, what is the maximum bus time for a child on a bus? First of all, did you know that there's a maximum amount of time? Some of you don't have to worry about it. Now, let's say Colleton County does, because it says when it's a district-wide system, it's supposed to be a maximum of 90 minutes for a student on a bus. Do we end up exceeding that sometimes? But like Colleton County has to worry about, because it's a district-wide. Horry County, because it's district-wide. Florence has 4 districts. So it's you would think that it shouldn't be a problem if they've got a max for those district-wide. Beaufort, it's put in place more so for those that are district-wide, because you've got more ground to cover, and it says 90 minutes. So what if they say, based on how far this bus has to travel and with traffic, if we release these kids 15 minutes early, it reduces their ride by 45 minutes because they beat the traffic? Does that justify it? No, you have to adjust the entire school day. Yeah, for everybody. Okay, next slide. Okay. Also, you have to deal with, here's on the question and answers for students with disabilities. who are eligible for transportation, and this is the 2009 guidance. The question was posed, if a child with a disability spends a significant amount of time being transported to and from school, as well as to and from another location, such as voc rehab, their job site, okay, to receive special education related services, is the child entitled to receive additional school time to make up for the time lost in transportation? Compensatory services. And that's what we've been talking about, right? Next slide. The answer is, in general, a school day for a child with a disability should not be longer or shorter than a school day for gen ed students. However, if a student's IEP team determines, and we know those exceptional circumstances, but in general, everybody should have the same length of day. Now, is there anyone who wants to volunteer to answer, does South Carolina have minimum length of school day requirements? Yes, we do. Tina, was that to answer the question, or do you have a question? I think she probably wanted to she wants
I
to
know
answer
the
a
answer to
question.
that question. And it's found at 59-1-425E. That tells you how long the school day is. And it's
You'll have to put that in
59.
the chat, Tina.
Yep, I will.
We're gonna get into it in 2 slides.
Oh, okay. I will.
Next slide.
Suzanne, Terry, did you also have a question? I thought I saw your hand up.
I don't think so.
Oh,
I
okay.
could come up with one, but I don't have one.
No, we're good. We're good.
Okay. This is a complaint that was filed with OCR, and here it was out of Virginia Beach Public Schools, and they filed it with OCR because they were alleging discrimination. When you're alleging discrimination, retaliation, or harassment, those go to OCR, which is within the U.S. Department of Ed. I have parents sometimes doing it for the U.S. Attorney's Office, Health and Human Services, and I'm like, no, education, education, not one of those other agencies. But in this one, they were alleging that students with, and it was a class complaint. They said students with disabilities are routinely dismissed from school before the end of the instructional day, required to use, here's one, separate bus loading and unloading areas. Does that sound familiar, Tina? Remember, there was one, last year on that? They arrived at school late in the morning. They rode segregated buses. Remember, we've been talking about that, and having buses just for students with disabilities, and endured unreasonable, lengthy bus rides. When you shorten their day, even for a multi-district agreement, compensatory services need to be considered for that child. And then students with disabilities who are dismissed before the end of the school day are given no meaningful opportunity to cover or make up the instruction, knowledge, or benefits that they have been denied due to early dismissal. Isn't that all this what we were talking about in the questions? And then here they had a board policy. It said non-disabled students receive a minimum of 6.5 hours of instructional time per day. And they said that districts were not, and well, it said, in addition, the board had a policy that says students with disabilities are guaranteed only 5.5 hours. So is that discriminatory? If you have a policy that says you have a minimum length of day for students at 6.5, but then you have another policy that says students with disabilities have to get 5.5, have to get at least 5.5. Why wouldn't it be the same? Okay, next slide.
How did they not know that was discriminatory when they wrote it? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Anyway, moving on.
So going back to South Carolina and minimum length of school day. We have a regulation 43-231I, which is the defined program for K through 12. And it says instruction in the subject area shall be scheduled for each student for a minimum of 1,800 minutes or 30 hours per week, including lunch. Or if you added that up for the year, they say you've got whatever that is times 180. That's your minimum time that you are to schedule students. And then we've got 6 through 8. And it's the same, including lunch. Now, what about high school? Next slide. And that's 43234C. And it says at least 6 hours excluding lunch. The other was including lunch. For high school, it's excluding lunch. And homeroom will not count as part of the instructional day. Okay. Next slide. This was a release, and it was a class action lawsuit filed against the Oregon Department of Education because it said that the state was violating IDEA by denying hundreds of students with disabilities a FAPE. Why was it saying that? Well, it said that children who as young as 5 and 6 were routinely excluded from attending a full day of school because of their disruptive behaviors. Shorten school days for behaviors rather than having documentation of putting in place additional services, supports, interventions, whatever was necessary to address those behaviors. And it said that students were often taught in separate classrooms with little opportunity to interact with their non-disabled peers. The complaint acknowledged that the state had taken efforts over the last few years to provide training and such as this, and saying you got to have the same length of day. You can't shorten across the board. You've got to address the behaviors. You've got to put in place intervention supports and services. But they said yes. Next slide. The state has done the trainings. The state has done these things. But the lawsuit also said that even though a state law was put in place, you know, that that, and it said that there was a presumptive right to the same number of hours of instruction, but that unilaterally limiting services and length of school day was still happening. And so they said it doesn't matter what training you do, what laws you put in place, if you're not monitoring it and if you're not enforcing it. So that was the lawsuit against, and they named the state because of the state's general supervision responsibility. And I'll tell you, in 2023, the U.S. Department of Ed came out with a memo to states reinforcing each state's general supervision responsibility to monitor and to correct issues of noncompliance. And especially things that you know are occurring or you're hearing that are recurring issues, that it is the state's responsibility to take steps to correct it. Next slide.
Karen Whitlock has a question over. Can we stop for that, or what? So if it takes 45 minutes for the student to go to voc rehab and 45 minutes to get back to school, they've lost an hour and a half of instructional time. Do we need to add to their day, or can we do something educational on the bus?
Yes. There are ways to address that. I think and it's funny because there was a district and they were doing that. They were when they were transporting the students with disabilities, and they put in a request to buy another bus so that they could put in equipment so that it could be an educational ride. But then my subsequent question was, I'm Debbie Downer or the spoiler. Is everybody on the bus going to need the same instruction? What is it that you're providing on the bus? Will it meet everybody's needs? Jenny has a disability in the area of reading comprehension. Marcus is in math. Jamie is something else. That's a good start though. That's problem solving. But then the thing is, make sure that what you're doing during that ride is going to meet the children's needs, because it could be that it's related to post-secondary transition, everything that's occurring, and that's very broad. That you have to make sure that you think it through. But yes, lengthening the school day or providing activities while they're being transported, yes, those are things. And again, the courts, the U.S. Department of Ed have consistently said school bus and bus driver bus driver shortages, all of these things are not reasons that will excuse the failure to provide students what they need in the area of transportation. And Okay, I guess I better pick up the pace.
You can have all morning, Barbara. No,
And
so
like,
what,
ah!
there was a follow-up to that question was, can I give them all a tablet to work on their own stuff?
It depends on what each child's IEP says. And it's just like no different than saying every kid, if you put them on home base, saying virtual instruction, that's not appropriate for every kid. Not every kid is going to have the ability to focus and work on something in that setting on transportation. It depends on what's in their IEPs. Okay. And here's a question. When does a child with a disability have a right to transportation to and from a school-related activities that occur outside the normal school hours, such as community service activities that are required by the school? The focus is on, is it required? If it's something that's optional and it's not related to something in the IEP, that's different than when it is related to something in the IEP. Or like when I said with the alternative school program, if you're saying that the student must participate in drug counseling or mental health counseling. So is it required, or is it something that, like, say if a kid wants to sign up for ROTC, and it's not related to a particular goal in their IEP. And as a part of it, they have to do certain things, or they're participating in marching band, and it's not related to something in their IEP, and it's not a multi-district kind of situation, then that's different. Then, but if you have a child who has certain socialization needs, and you've said that kid really likes this and doesn't have any behavioral problems there, and there's some things we need to, or the kid is suffering from anxiety, but it's not as bad in these types of situations, so you've put something that's outside of school hours in their IEP, then it makes it required and you have to provide that transportation. So it depends. Oh, I haven't said that in a while. Next slide.
Barbara, let me just interrupt you. I don't want you to feel like you have until 11. Please don't rush, because this is really great information that you're sharing, and we can always do a part 2. We'll find another date. We can all get together and do another like webinar kind of situation, or we'll find a date we can tag you in with one of our other DLAs meetings, because this is just great information. So don't feel like you have to power through, and you've got great information to share. So I just wanted to say that.
Okay. Okay. So, and then also don't forget about discipline. Just like you have to deal with behavioral issues within the context of the school building. Remember, I said think of transportation as an extension of the educational program, because it is. And so there are transportation issues where all of those requirements for behavioral intervention plans and training your bus drivers and the assistants on how to address those behaviors. If that child has a behavioral intervention plan for what's happening, in the classroom or unstructured time in the building, and nothing that carries over to the bus, that's problematic. Next slide. So go back, refer to
Oh,
your question and answer documents that the U.S. Department of Ed put out in the summer of 2022. They did one that deals with IDEA, and they also did one that deals with Section 504. Okay, next slide.
and that was summer of 2022 for
Yes.
transportation. Okay, I'll pull
No,
those up.
they're both on discipline, but there are also questions about
Oh,
that relate to transportation. Like
gotcha.
here in this one that's under the IDA one, it says, are informal removals such as administratively shortened school days considered a school day when calculating a disciplinary change in placement? And I always put this question in my discipline presentations, but it also applies here, because when the administrator shortens that kid's day and sends that kid home early, whether it's on the bus or parent pickup, that is a day. The IDA's implementing regulations define a school day as any day, including a partial day, that children attend school. So if that kid is sent home early for your count of 10 for behavioral issues, that's one of your 10 days. And some people mix that up, especially at the high school level, when you're looking at attendance. And they're like, ooh, to count this kid as being present, I've got to wait till 12:16 to get over my 50% so I can mark the kid as present. That's different than when that kid is sent home for, or grandmama's called to pick that kid up. When you're doing your count for IDEA discipline, that's one of your days.
Okay,
You're,
I have a quick question on that.
yes,
This
Karen.
is Karen Whitlock. Thank you. So, you know that buses are a huge issue, and having a shortage of bus drivers all over the state. So, if we know that a bus driver is absent, sometimes students will be sent home early because of the double bus route or whatever. So, somebody in the district decides to send a kid, not just a kid, but a bus home early. If it's a general education bus and there happens to be a special ed kid on the bus, is that a shortened school day, or it's not because
Yes.
we've included all kids on it?
It is a shortened day because you have shortened. We have a state regulation that says what the minimum length of school day is, and plus their schedule and their IEP is written for a certain number of amount of time. So that's a situation, especially if it's happening repeatedly, where the team needs to look at what's the negative impact and do we have to provide compensatory services. That is one of those things that could, where the team needs to consider the negative impact.
Okay, so even if it's a regular ed bus, but my
It
special ed
doesn't
kid
matter.
is
A
on
bus
that
is a
bus,
bus.
that's right. Okay, just making sure because I know those are things the transportation department tries to do.
Yeah, when that school is an administratively shortened day, the team needs to look at the negative impact. Administrative removal equals informal removal equals the same as a situation where if that kid were suspended. Mostly I'm talking about for behaviors, but it could be the bus driver shortages, all of those things. Remember, you don't have the folks. You've got to look at, and it's a real issue now. What is the negative impact? It's the same as if you don't have a speech language provider. You don't have an OT provider. What is the negative impact? Transportation, it has to be, we have to start looking at it the same way. And it doesn't matter because remember when I said we're trying to get out of that labeling buses and saying a bus is a bus is a bus? The rule is going to be the same no matter whatever the percentage of kids with or without disabilities whose butts are in the seat. Okay. And when it's for behavior, again, that is one of your days. Next slide. And sending the kid, just like sending the kid to the office, we didn't send him home, but he did sit in the the office for half the day or quarter of the day. The kicker is that student excluded from their school day and from instruction? Were they excluded from instruction and from being with their non-disabled peers to the same extent that they would have but for this event occurring? That's the kicker. Next slide. Okay, here's another question. When a child's IEP requires transportation as a related service, are bus suspensions subject to the IDEA's discipline protections for determining a change in placement? Yes. You have to look at how it impacts access to education. So when bus transportation is in that IEP as a related service, it's no different than OT/PT speech, okay? You have to provide it. How you provide it might change. But now, what if Miss Shirley says, I will bring Joshua to school? I'm good. That's fine. But what if Miss Shirley says, well, how are you going to get Joshua to school? Because it's in his transportation's in his IEP. I don't care if I have 4 vehicles sitting in my yard. His IEP says specialized transportation. Do you then have to provide another way for Joshua to get to school? Yes. Just like anything else in that IEP. It is an entitlement then to transportation. Okay. Next slide. just reinforcing, address interfering behaviors that occur during transportation the same way you would with behaviors in the classroom or in the hallway or in the lunchroom. If you need a functional behavioral assessment or behavioral intervention plan, or you need to do training on that child's behavioral intervention plan, then it needs to happen and include bus personnel. If you're only having problems on the bus, think about it. Why is it? Is it because that's one of those unstructured times and there are no expectations and that's where the opportunity is arising? Address it. Next slide.
Barbara, if I can just interrupt, this is probably why you can't get done in the allotted time because I keep butting in. But I started at session telling you that my sister's been a bus driver for 31 years. And this is one of the
Bless her.
problems is that like people don't tell her what are the accommodations. And so I always tell her, you should know all the accommodations of those children on your bus that apply to you. If they need extra time on their math test, you don't need to know that, and they don't need to tell you that. But if they have a functional behavioral assessment and and I tell her a FIBA and a BIP, I kind of trained her on those things. Like, you need to have a copy of that, or at least know what it says so that you can follow through, and and if it has, like, they should also be, sometimes those things get developed with the classroom in mind, the cafeteria, the library, and then people kind of forget, like, hey, what about the bus ride? That's a different scenario too. So like if they forgot to include that piece, she needs to know that too. So it's good to don't forget your bus drivers.
Exactly. And we just recently had a due process hearing, and it was to challenge the MDR, and it dealt with the bus. And this was a particular case where the bus driver wasn't knowledgeable of what was going on in the school. Now, the result of the hearing decision was that, and it was more so if the parent had had a knowledgeable advocate versus the advocate the parent had, or an attorney, I think the decision would have been much different. Because when a parent is trying to argue, a parent sometimes gets focused on this thing over here and can't see the forest for the trees, and they miss the big argument. I think that, I clearly saw a route where that could have ended in that parent's favor, but I, had to remind the hearing officer the burden was on the parent. And did the parent put up the evidence? It's much different than a complaint. The standard is much different. With that, you can see where there are all kinds of violations in a case, but the parent misses the mark in presenting their case in a hearing, which may benefit the school district to get a ruling in their favor. But there are all kind of red flags and red lights because, and this was a situation where, in my opinion, the district knew this kid had issues and there were accommodations in the IEP for the classroom, but that bus driver wasn't brought in. And then if you look at the behaviors on the bus, they were closely connected or the similar types of behaviors as what was occurring in school. So one of the things was the parent missed the mark, but they were still a part of the remedy was that the bus driver, because there were some other things, that the bus driver be brought in to the IEP process and receive training, once they, complete the FIBA and redo the BIP, because they were on those other things, they were gonna need to reconvene. And so it was also then strongly recommended that the bus driver be brought in. But that was all, but the only reason they didn't get that specific violation on overturning the MDR on the behavior on the bus was because the parent didn't put up a good case.
Wow.
And which dispute resolution mechanism they chose. Administration of medication, just like Sarah was saying with regard to her sister. The OCR has consistently ruled that bus drivers must be aware of what? Each student with a disability or medical issue when there's a risk of it occurring when that student is riding on that bus. Because it is need to know. If you've got a kid who has a learning disability and you're not putting up screens and trying to instruct them on that bus, then that's not a need to know. But if that kid has a medical issue or behavioral issue that can put folks at risk, that bus driver and staff on the bus need to know. And it's not only with an IEP, but with a 504 plan. They need to know if there's a behavioral intervention plan and how to implement it, because just telling them you have it, because there was a recent complaint where the bus driver could only go on what the information was that the bus driver had. Okay. But then we also had a situation where we had to review a video from another district where, and I was, as I age, my hair's already getting thinner. I didn't need to be pulling out the strands that I have, but I'm watching this video, and what was the adult assistant on the bus doing? Had her phone videotaping the kid getting out of his wheelchair. It went over the course of almost an hour because of the nature of the kid's disabilities, and it wasn't easy for him to get out of that wheelchair. But from the camera on the bus, we see the aide videotaping the kid. It was like, what do you think your role is supposed? What were you hired for on the bus? That you're supposed to make sure the kid is safe. Just outrageous. But relevant information, including medication that a student may be taking, especially that seizure activity, or what if you have a kid who has diabetes and their blood sugar level drops or it goes high on the bus, and the bus driver has no idea of what the signs are to look for or what they're supposed to do, and that child may need the pills to bring that blood sugar level up or insulin to bring that blood sugar level down. We've had cases where kids with cardiac issues. And then I've had one situation where it was actually the reverse, and it came out through a call with the district where the kid was in renal failure. And the kid was then transferred to the alternative school. And the folks and it was a training with alternative school folks. And they said, you know how we found out the kid was in renal failure? The bus driver, Miss Busybody in the neighborhood, happened to say, oh, he's got bad kidneys, right? And he's not supposed to be eating stuff with potassium. They found out from the bus driver, but only because she knew the family and she knew the child. So everybody who has a need to know basis needs to know these things. Okay, next slide. Because if a student who's in or a person who's in renal failure and their kidneys aren't flushing potassium, they may eat tomatoes and a banana in the same day, and because potassium is building up in their kidneys, end up in the emergency room and on dialysis. How do I know that? It happened to my mother. She was being bad. She had orange juice and stewed tomatoes, and the evidence was there. And she ended up in the hospital and on dialysis because that was the only way to purge that potassium out of her system. Wow. But also on the training of how to administer. What about a kid with allergies?
The EpiPen, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And so looking back in the chat, Barbara, Carol Ann Barnes asked, are there requirements for a second adult on the bus if a child has a medical issue that might require immediate medication, like a seizure? But really, it goes with all of these, like what level? Well, Carol Ann, I don't want to bump on your question, are there requirements for a second adult on the bus? That's her question.
The requirement is rooted in IDEA, Section 504, and the ADA. What does the child need to meet their unique and individual needs, or to appropriately accommodate that kid or ensure they have access to education? So it goes back to the IEP team. Because under state law, with the bus drivers, what aren't they? I'm going to say can't. What are they not supposed to do? Be out of that seat with the bus running. So if you've got a kid who may need emergency healthcare needs and you know about it ahead of time, or you have a child who has to be loaded using that bus lift, and because for the lift to operate, what has to happen? The bus has to be running. And we have a state law that says if that bus is running, where's the bus driver's butt supposed to be? In the seat.
In the seat.
So how can you be in the seat and administer medication, or in the seat and operating the bus lift? You can't, right? So that means you have to have what on that bus? A second person. But we currently do not have a state law that requires a second adult on all buses. However, as I presented at Fall Admin, there is pending legislation. And this is carrying over into the current legislative session. And it's all because of a situation that resulted in a lawsuit. And because we own the bus, guess who else was named? And guess who, even though we had nothing to do with what happened on that bus, guess whose insurance had to pay out $1 million as a part of the settlement? The department. The district was on the hook for more, but our attorneys also settled because it was dragging on. And there's a clear videotape, and it's a child with autism, and she's in her child restraint system because she's a younger child. Not to punish. Don't use child safety seats and devices on buses to punish kids. They're only there for safety reasons. But this kid is there, and there's another child, and when you watch the videotape, the other child is repeatedly getting up out of his seat and just pounding on this 4-year-old. And she is screaming at the top of her lungs. And what is the bus driver doing? And this was on the news, so it's not divulging anything. Bus drivers just going along. You've got this 4-year-old in the car seat just crying, and you've got this other kid just wailing on her. Then he takes a rest and he goes back to his seat. He comes back. After his break, he comes back and he wails on her some more. As a result of that, there is pending legislation to require all districts to have a second person on all school buses. Right now, it's just required for if it's in the IEP or 504 plan, or if it's a district policy. But there is pending legislation to require a second person on all buses because of that particular lawsuit. Not just the lawsuit, but the fact that, again, it's been all over the internet. And that's a South Carolina situation. With sharing information with the bus drivers or staff on buses, sometimes people incorrectly will say HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, prohibits us from sharing that information. No, it doesn't. HIPAA does deal with the release, exchange of medical information. However, HIPAA has an exclusion in it. It excludes covered entities, schools, and universities already covered under FERPA. Education is covered by FERPA. HIPAA does not apply to the education setting except for information that goes outside of education. For example, billing Medicaid. Because you are transmitting information to the Department of Health and Human Services for the reimbursement, that is not an educational entity. So that's when HIPAA comes into play, because we are sending it outside of the educational arena. When a doctor sends information to us, the doctor's covered by HIPAA. We are not. We are covered by FERPA. So again, when you hear your school psychologists, speech and language people, OTPTs, and they say, oh, I can't do that because of HIPAA. HIPAA doesn't apply to the school setting. We are covered under FERPA. And FERPA has an exclusion for people with a legitimate educational interest and that is people who are providing services to that child. Not a cafeteria lady who doesn't have to do anything with this child, doesn't need to know that. Custodial services, if they don't have anything to do with this child, other than if the child has an issue and OSHA requirements come into play, they don't need to know it. But that bus driver and whoever's on that bus may have a legitimate educational interest. You just have to make sure that you counsel them on they are not to share that information with anyone else. Okay. Next slide. So what do our bus drivers need? They need to receive notice that if there's a student on their bus who has diabetes and their blood sugar may either drop or go high on the bus. They have to be, if that's the case, they have to be trained. And what are the symptoms? What are the signs? What do I do? If you have a rule that says no snacks, no food on the bus, but you have a child who has diabetes and their IEP allows them to have access to snacks to regulate their blood sugar, then they need to know that so that you don't end up with a situation. Child may need extra medical supplies on that bus because of their healthcare needs. And especially, we ended up with a situation with a field trip with one of our buses, and middle school students, and they went to DC and they chartered a bus. And this child with autism, they left that child they went to the Jefferson Memorial, they left that child on the bus with the bus driver because one of the chaperones didn't show up. And so the child went, and the child with the disability was a 7th grader. The sibling was an 8th grader. Both classes grades went on the trip. So they told the older sibling, you're responsible for your brother. Well, she got with her friends and she went with her friends. So they left this kid on the bus. The next thing you know, the mother is here in South Carolina and gets a call that her child has run off the bus and has run into the way of traffic in DC. Because this, the child doesn't know this bus driver. It's a chartered bus. The bus driver doesn't know the child. And something happened and it freaked the child out, and the child ran off the bus and is out there amongst traffic and with people trying to get into the parking. And then this parent gets this call because they've got to find the sister because they can't get the bus driver's freaking out. He calls somebody, he doesn't know what's going on. And when he tries to grab the child, that is causing the child's anxiety levels and to escalate. So now they're at the Jefferson Memorial trying to find the sister who's with her friends, and they put it on the sister to de-escalate him to get him back to the bus. Who thinks that's right? Nobody, I hope. But I hope. Next slide. And there may need to be training on using EpiPens and the signs, because some triggers will affect you very quickly. I have allergies. I know it. And I don't know it, one of the things I'm allergic to is certain perfumes and colognes. But I may not know that there's someone in that room, and I don't know every cologne or perfume that I'm allergic to. And the reaction can be slow or it can be immediate, and my airway will close up. What if you have a kid who's allergic to bees and they're out on a field trip and they get stung? A kid who has an asthma attack. And then what if somebody calls in? What's the contingency plan? Timing must also be taken into account. This particular case was a federal court case, and it dealt with the amount of time when that child had a seizure, whether or not there was sufficient time for the staff on the bus to react as to whether or not there was appropriate personnel or whether the child needed some other type of transportation. If you can show with the staff that you have on the bus that they can respond within the recommended period of time to ensure that that child's safety remains intact, then that's the kicker. If there is no plan and there's no contingency plan, that's when you could end up in a contract situation or having to hire more staff for a bus. Okay, because in this particular case, 5 minutes, there was a 5-minute window. And so whether or not there's staff on that bus that could respond and get that medication to that child within 5 minutes. Okay, next slide.
Barbara, excuse me, let me ask you, we have about 6 minutes left. Is this a good time to stop or just a couple more slides? Like, do you know where there's a good stopping point? And then we'll do a part 2 at another time?
I can finish in 6 minutes. I gotta like name that tune.
Barbara,
Bid a
you're
note,
only
I
at the
can bid a
halfway
minute.
point. We don't want you to do that. We don't want you to do that. We're gonna call you back. You know that.
Do y'all want me to finish in 6 minutes, or do you want to have part 2?
All right, there's your everybody put your cameras on, please. And Amishiko, you had the right idea. Hand here's
Hey,
the
you try
sign
to
for
sway the
stop.
vote.
Here's the sign language for stop. And then here's this part 2. So stop now, like let her just keep going and she'll end today, or a part 2. Do you want her to do a part 2 at another time?
Or do you want me
Or
to
just-
finish in
Or
5
just
minutes?
keep going, and just stop. Let her keep going. All right, keep going, Barbara.
Keep going.
They say keep going, keep going.
I didn't see the vote, so yes.
Yeah, just there. Yep, on there. All right, I'll quit yapping.
Okay.
Now I've lost my. Hang on.
Okay.
Sorry.
No. This is. She's playing peekaboo with me.
I know. I'm like trying to find it again now. Oh my gosh. Okay, here we go. Go. Ready, go.
Okay. And again, that there were just other examples of discrimination, but then the consequences of failure to implement the IEPs and ensure safety can be the same as those things with school. Next slide. You have to ensure the safety. And again, that's where 504 and the ADA come into account. Next slide. Be prepared. Be proactive. Think about what could happen. Have contingency plans. Next slide. Identify each child's specific needs and how do you meet those. Gather the information within FERPA, and you can share those information. Think about fire drills, bus evacuations. Have those plans in place beforehand. Don't get caught with your pants down and don't have something in place, because you know when there's a bomb threat, what do? We put the kids sometimes on buses and transport them somewhere else. What is your plan? You know, what if you have a kid with brittle bone syndrome, a kid with heart issues, lung issues, with asthma? Do you have kits where you can have their allergy medication, the insulin, grab and go kits that are things that need to be refrigerated, where if you've got to evacuate the school and put the kids on buses and take them somewhere else for the parents to pick up, where you can grab those kits in the event that a kid has a medical emergency. Next slide. After school programs. Think about that. How are we going to make sure if there's an after school field trip that people have the appropriate training, those bus drivers? Next slide. This was a Lexington 5 case. I started to take out the name of the district and just put a South Carolina district. But sometimes people want the name so they can, these are actually on the OCR's website. And sometimes they want to be able to see the full letter, so I left it in. In this particular case, the parent filed the complaint with OCR, and it dealt with this kid had some dietary allergies, and would have allergic responses to nuts, eggs, dairy, and strawberries. In this particular case, it didn't just deal with school, but it also dealt with the fact with regard to there was only one lunch option on school field trips. You know how they say you're going to have a peanut butter sandwich and some milk or this and this, and it didn't take into account accommodations for this child's food allergies. And then what if you end up with a younger child who, if you give them that lunch, they're just going to take it. And if the people on the bus don't know, on the field trip don't know. Next slide. But that's the summation, of this particular OCR complaint, and the fact of how what the district needed to do to make sure that they had an alternate lunch for the student. But the parent said, not only that, you need to make sure that everybody is appropriately trained, that they know what the signs are, that they know how to treat the child. It's not just about the extra lunch, because if it's a peanut allergy, it could be just touching another surface that the other child touched and having a reaction. Next slide. Okay, so what does the law require? Again, you have to, it's just reiterating, you have to take those preventative measures. You have to think about it as teams, not just with what happens in the classroom and the common areas, but also, again, on field trips and other school related activities. Next slide. 504, in addition to IDEA and ADA, are going to apply in those situations. Next slide. Okay, and again, the child may need have an IHP, an individual health care plan. Bus drivers and other persons on who are dealing with the kid, again, it's an extension of the educational program. Next slide. See, that's where it came in handy, putting in the name of the school district. So if somebody needs to pull it, they can go back and look at it. This one is an old one. It's one from Saluda, and it also deals with the nut allergies. And you see number 4 is that one part of what they had to do was provide notice to all parents at the school and on the school bus for the types of exposure that can result in an allergic reaction. Next slide. Okay. Know who is where and when with regard to your kids in planning. Have your strategies. Again, be proactive. Identify the teachers. Know their schedules. If something happens and there's an emergency, if you have a kid who you got to evacuate on a bus, does that bus driver or what do staff have perhaps access to noise canceling headphones, fidget items, do social studies, prepare those kids for what's going to happen in that emergency situation in the event that you have to evacuate that building and those kids are on a bus. Plan ahead for those emergency situations. Have emergency plans, safety plans. Next slide. We've had situations where during the drills where instead of putting the kids through disabilities through the full drill, they'll say, go to the library. And then the person who's supposed to then check on the child in the library, or if it's a real event, evacuate the kids from the library, isn't there that day. What's your contingency plan? Next slide. What's happening?
Miss Sarah looks frozen.
Okay.
And you are correct. I just got a text from her that said my internet just went out.
Ah. Well, that was handy. Now she's got control of the stats.
I guess you're done, Barbara.
She's probably tried to log back on. Well, that was tricky, wasn't it? How many of you think that sometimes
apparently she wanted to end at 11.
Okay, well, I guess we may be ending. Are there any questions then? In the interim, I can't answer questions. Or do you want me to just summarize what's in the rest, or go ahead and do the part 2 won't be very. Look who's back. Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm like, I swear I did not do that on purpose. I'm like,
oh, we took a vote and we decided otherwise.
I know. There we go. All right, here you are. That's Sarah McKay. Oh man. Okay. All right. Did you want me to go to the next slide now?
Yes, ma'am.
I hope it's still recording. Good grief. All right.
Okay.
There you are.
And again, do your social stories, familiarize students with evacuation plans, practice, reinforce, discuss, practice again. Next slide. We talked about the administration of medication and what our drivers and bus folks need to know. Next slide. Inform and train your adults. This is just a reinforcement of stuff that we've already talked about. Next slide. Harassment and bullying, you know, you have to address it. Now, on the service animals, I don't know if you'll have a lot of questions or if you want me to maybe do a separate piece just on the service animals. I will, since it is a point and it is a versus just being a reiteration, I will give you guys that. Do you want me to include it here, or would you like to, with regard to transportation, because everything, it's the same as when you're dealing with a request for service animal in the regular school setting.
Mm-hmm. Would you put your answers in the chat, please? You'd like her to do a separate more in depth about service animals? I see some folks in the chat thought we were scheduled till noon, so, okay. One person said have that be a separate presentation. That might be easier if we can see your faces. If you want to unmute more in depth, somebody said thumbs up if it more in depth, separate presentation on that. Yeah, separate. That's what people are saying. So Barbara, yeah, for the service animals, let's do that as a separate piece.
Yeah, so then we are at a good stopping point.
All right. All right. So let's do that then. And I will thank you so much. I just love listening to your presentations, and I apologize for dropping you there. Dang internet. I hate when that happens. Doesn't happen often, but wouldn't you know?
It's kind of like, remember the old days? I'm saying the old days with your house phone, and or I guess people still do it with cell phones when you get an uncomfortable topic and you go, I can't hear you. The static. I think we click. Right. I think the call dropped.
That's right. That's right. Well, Barbara, thank you so much. I know that you are already taken and spoken for our next one is on February 16th. So we'll figure something out. We'll find another date to have you come back and do the rest of your presentation. So thank you so much. For the folks who are still online here, I will let you know that next month on the 16th, we are meeting. I'm so sorry. I guess this is the month I messed up, whether it's a Thursday or a Friday, but or whatever the day of the week is. But next month it is Friday, February 16th. But we are not meeting at the charter school like we have been all year. We're going to be over at the School for the Deaf and the Blind Outreach Center. And I will, of course, put all this in an email, but I do want to share it with you now so you kind of have an idea, and I'll send you the address and so forth. But it is over next to the, it's in, if you're familiar with this area, it is in Synergy Business Park, 101 Executive Center Drive. It's right off I-20 on Bush River Road. It's right in here. And so when you go into the park, it's this first building on your left, and you walk in the door, and you just keep going straight back. And there's a buzzer on the wall, and they'll let you in. So we'll probably just stand at the door because there'll be a lot of people. But that's where we'll be, and we'll have Scott Falcone, the director of the Outreach Center, will talk to us about all the things the Outreach Services offers. We'll have Marty McKenzie talking about vision and students with low vision and who are blind. We'll have Robert Hill talking about students who are deaf or hard of hearing or are deaf blind. And I've got one more, but she hasn't confirmed, so I won't tell you about that one. So anything else we need to cover right now before I send you on your way? No? Oh, wait, I see something in the chat. I didn't. Excellent presentation. Again, all directors need to hear the second presentation. You know, that's
actually gonna say, if I'm not, the other Sarah has a hold on my calendar for the for that date for the next meeting. Joyce Cunningham and Tina Ross can do the service animal piece. Joyce Cunningham is an expert.
Joyce Cunningham and Tina Ross. All right, you heard it straight from the source. So I'll be tapping those two people. But the part about the service animals, so this is recorded. Barbara, I forgot to ask you. I hope it's okay that I recorded you. And so we'll get it captioned.
That's
and I'll
called
put
asking
it in
for forgiveness rather than
Yes, it is. But I'll put it in your folder. But like last time, we had a virtual meeting. I will share it with all of the directors because Barbara, you just have such great information. Like I don't want to. Cynthia, I'll answer your question. And do we have veto powers, Tina? I'm not going to read over there. See, that's why I can't read other things and talk at the same time. So I see what happened. I
Squirrel.
thought I sent out an email already. Yeah, I'm already distracted. So yeah, I will share this recording with Barbara's permission out to the field for everyone because it's such great information. And then once it's captioned, and you're you are right. The last time I spoke with you, if you were in the room at the time, we said February 15th was something else. I think somebody put it in. Oh, it was the monthly data meeting. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe Carolyn like has those. They're always on a Thursday. So then I was going to move it to the 14th and somebody said, no, that's SCASA. And I'm like, how about the 16th? And somebody said, oh, our calendars are free that day. So that's how we ended up on Friday, the 16th. So I'm sorry. It was like probably only like 10 or 12 of you were there that day. So it is on Friday, the 16th. That way you're not missing all those other meetings where you can get some great information. But boy, we do meeting you to death, but we give you a lot of good information. So I hope that's so Barbara says it's great that you have sufficient time to recover by the next session. Bring all your questions, of course. Tina's already saying she wants veto power and cough, cough. She thinks she's already getting sick. So, we work hard, and I think it's good to have a good sense of humor and to be able to laugh a little bit when you can, because laughing is a stress releaser. If you know anything about, your cortisol and your stressors in your body and all of that, like you have to have something to do, whether you are somebody who goes out and runs or plays tennis or goes, hangs out with your buddies, but you have to have something. Laughter is something you can do all day long. So I'm not saying do it all day long, but when you can fit it in, and it kind of releases some of the stress that you have to deal with. So thank you again for being here today. I will get this recording captioned and out to you, and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.